invite the first speaker from the proposition team to open the debate.
When a young liberal undergrad on his gap year goes to a slum, takes a photo with some children and puts it on Facebook, claiming that she finally understands the color and texture of life in poverty, she's part of the principal problem. And so we stand by the principle that poverty should not be a spectator sport. Slum tours are commercial immersion tours that privilege affluent tourists take to impoverished areas, like the Samnong slums of Cambodia or the favelas of Brazil. Slum tourists are not aid workers. They are transient, and their primary focus is not improving the lives of the poor, but indulging in the vicarious experience of observing poverty. Slums form when government provision of basic services is so weak that people are forced to build their own systems of exchange and protection. Slums are thus legal black holes where, despite people's aspirations, the rule of law is weak, poverty is endemic, and crime is rife. This is what tourists are taken to see. Our stance is simple. We accept slum tourism may bring short-term economic benefit. However, these benefits are grossly unsustainable and are outweighed by the host of harm slum tourism brings, both in principle and in practice. This is not a comparative between slum tourism and no aid. We support NGOs helping and partnering with local governments to uplift slum communities and increase public awareness of poverty. Efforts like the slum upgrading project between the Mumbai Municipal Authority and UN Habitat have led to actual results, like schools and utilities being built in neighborhoods. We have three arguments. One, that slum tourism perpetuates systemic institutional failure that robs people of dignity. Two, it entrenches endemic poverty. And three, my second speaker will tell you why, it demeans the people of slums. So, first argument on perpetuating systemic institutional failure. And our principle is that poverty is a structural problem, and that the incentive structures of tour agencies and governments coincide to worsen poverty within slum communities. Slum tourism often reduces government support to communities which are already neglected and disenfranchised, because governments now have the perfect excuse to foist responsibility onto tour agencies. While governments know that the money from slum tourism isn't a substitute for services like a police force or utilities, they say, surely these tour agencies are doing precisely the sort of work we need to make people's lives better and wash their hands of responsibility. Significantly, no. Even goodwill government attempts to relocate people to less overcrowded areas with better sanitation often fail, because people go back to crowded city centers where slum tourism takes place and where poverty and disease are often much more severe. Therefore, slums are systemically unregulated and fall outside government monitoring and policing. This causes two harms. First, undiscerning tourist activity creates criminal activity. And this is because tourists don't understand that in the absence of a government monopoly of force, the main authority in slums is criminal in nature. And this means tourist dollars go to gangs. Yes?
As slum tourism become a more viable option, why won't governments be incentivized to provide more policing to protect people who go to those areas?
We don't think this is how it works, right? Like, if people go to slums because they are poor, because there are areas which are almost impossible to regulate, to observe the authenticity of slum life, then government regulation undermines that. Governments have no incentive to do so when they can get money from it. Back to my point. Who do you think tour agencies get to provide the cars and logistics and guards when tourists go through slums? It's local organizations run by criminal syndicates, because they are the only ones with the power and capacity in slums. Of every dollar that is given to a child beggar, 90 cents is taken by organized crime. These are the exact same syndicates that kidnap children to turn them into beggars. And this is why child abduction rates in the Ravi slums of India are 3 times higher, because slum tourism is rife as compared to other Indian slums. These are syndicates that demand the profits of street vendors engage in violent turf wars that kill hundreds of innocents. So every time tourists buy trinkets, they fund criminal gangs that use this money for human trafficking and the sex trade. So, when slum tourists see people living in slums as mere outlets for their moral angst, this isn't just demeaning in principle, but inadvertently worsens institutional failure in slums, hurting the people. Second, tour agencies have an overwhelming incentive to keep slums underdeveloped. Because tour agencies get most of the money from slum tourists. And this money doesn't go back to the people in slums, because investing in slums undermines their very own business model, which is built on slum poverty. What they do is bribe local officials to turn a blind eye to the problems of slums. We see the experience of South America and India, where there are 12 levels of local government, tells us that corruption will let tour agencies keep slums poor. So, slum tourism perpetuates institutional failure, and in principle, it robs people of their dignity. No. Second argument, that slum tourism reinforces the cycle of poverty by altering the incentives of people living in slums. Our principle is one of sustainable development, and this means people in slums need to find gainful employment. In many cases, this may mean parents sending children to small free schools run by the UN or a missionary agency or an NGO.
Sir.
At the very least, hold on. It means children learning a skill or a trade like carpentry or being a mechanic. Before I move on, yes.
If your contention is that the seasonality of this income makes it a problem, why can't people save that money in the first place and two, work another job when that seasonal income isn't coming in?
One, we say people often don't get the income from slum tourism. I told you criminal networks are the ones that get it. Deal with that analysis first. Back to my point. So, however, slum tourism skews parents' incentives away from long-term development. Because even if the amount of money is tiny, because of the criminal syndicates I just talked about, the allure of easy, immediate money from simply having a child to beg reduces the incentive for parents to invest in their children's future. And that's why the most successful slums in the world, and that's why the slums of Phnom Penh, have seen literacy rates stagnate. Because parents leave their children at home to sell souvenirs to tourists, even though education is free. Compare this to other slums in Cambodia, where because people get to use free schools, literacy is rising and poverty steadily falling. When individuals choose short-term gain, they sacrifice their long-term development. And that's why slum tourism hurts the principle of sustainable development. But furthermore, slum tourism insidiously causes communities to value and internalize poverty. When poverty is no longer something that traps you and limits your potential, but something your entire economic life is built around. When you sell your poverty to the white man who values you only because you are poor, this is not only disgusting in principle, but your aspirations to escape poverty are warped. And that's why the single most successful slum community in the world is in Manila. Because in Manila, slums are built around rubbish dumps, so tourists are unwilling to go there. But this means that we've seen a huge and thriving industry built around recycling society's waste spring up in these slums. And year on year, we see families gaining enough money from vibrant internal industries to send their children to school, to lift themselves out of poverty, to help their family members. See, reliance on slum tourism destroys this initiative, destroys the capacity of people to lift themselves out of poverty. And reliance on this inconsistent, small and frankly condescending source of income from slum tourism only hurts people further. Slum tourism worsens the institutional failures that create poverty. But worse, it makes people believe that poverty is the limit of their aspirations. We support the principle that people deserve dignity, and slum tourism robs them of even that.
For this speech, and now to open the case of opposition, I will call upon the opposition team.
Mr. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, tourism plays a key role in the economic development strategy of so many countries around the world, from regions like the Caribbean, the north of Africa, to right here in Southeast Asia. And proposition believe that slum residents should be excluded from the benefits that it brings. Why is that? They contend that they live lives so bad that apparently just to look at them is to humiliate them. That apparently just to take a picture of their culture, the way in which they live, is somehow disparaging. Because apparently to give these people your patronage is inherently patronizing. No justification to distinguish this type of tourism in its dehumanizing nature from any other type of tourism, for instance. None of that analysis stood, ladies and gentlemen. So Team Ireland is proud to oppose this motion, with a case consisting of 3 points. Firstly, the direct economic benefits of slum tourism. Secondly, the indirect economic benefits of slum tourism. And thirdly, the benefits of changes, the beneficial changes in perception. We bring you this case of the team line of engagement with slums is socially and economically empowering. No, thank you. I'm going to go with the first 2 points. Our second speaker is going to do the third. But ultimately, this debate is going to be won and lost on 3 criteria. Firstly, are there harms associated with slum tourism? Secondly, are those harms actively caused by slum tourism?
Point of information.
Thank you. And thirdly, do those harms outweigh the benefits that we are going to show you? Before I get into Team Ireland's case, I'm going to deal with some of the rebuttal we got out of this side. So firstly, their point on dehumanization. 3 points.
Information, sir.
No, thank you. Firstly, that's based on a false premise that tourists are only interested in poverty. Firstly, that's a cynical characterization of what tourists are like. You don't think they did enough to show that was true. But moreover, it's most likely that these people are going to go to a slum to experience and engage with a culture that they're unfamiliar with.
Information.
No, thank you. Things like the music of Soweto, things like the football culture that develops in Brazil. Because people inherently, ultimately prefer authentic, uplifting, and empowering narratives to disempowering ones. So there's no harm there. No, thank you. Secondly, importantly, to rebut to this, because of that, tour companies are actively incentivized to show those narratives, which means that this type of tourism is in fact actively beneficial and empowering because it allows them to present an actual fair representation of the culture.
Information.
Thirdly, no, thank you. All they can show you is that poverty is difficult. So that we say we agree, but they've never shown why that harm is exacerbated by slum tourism. That's 3 points of rebuttal to that, which they're going to respond to in their next speech. I'll take you.
If we don't think it's alright to objectify men and women's bodies in sex tourism, why is it okay to objectify their poverty?
Because I just told you, they're not
tourism?
objectifying their poverty. They're not going because of the poverty, they're going because they want to engage with the culture. How can you engage fully with the culture of a city like Mumbai without engaging with the slum culture, ladies and gentlemen? When so many people in that place do live in that way, it's fundamentally ridiculous to suggest that. On their point on seasonality, our objective that came to a point of debate which they never dealt with. These people can A, save that money that they make, and B, they can work other jobs and not make that income. No response to that. The best they can do is mitigate that benefit. No, thank you. Finally, on this point about criminality, I think that's a fundamentally weird characterization they've given us of slums. But furthermore, if that's the case, more people going to slums is going to incentivize better policing of slums. I'll get onto that more in my substantive case. So, Team Ireland's first point, direct economic benefits of slum tourism. First thing in this is that going to a slum firstly necessitates actual engagement, no thank you, with that slum in an economic sense. What does that look like? It looks like going to get food, going to get water. Often it's very hot on these tours, local restaurants or whatever. It looks like getting gifts and trinkets for people.
Information.
No, thank you. When they want to, engage in that or bring something back from that place. But they also want to get local services, things like buses or whatever. So all of these things is real money.
Information,
real
sir.
people. No, thank you. So we're more than happy to concede, by the way, that there's a spectrum of people involved in this. That money goes into the slums and out of the slums in various ways. I'm going to deal with more in my speech about why that doesn't matter later on. What we have to say is that tour guides are actively incentivized to maximize your economic engagement with the slum because they want to provide that authentic and immersive
Point of
experience.
information.
Thank you, because the tour guide wants to get a tip. So of course they're incentivized to find like the best local restaurants or whatever. They're incentivized to maximize the benefit that a slum tour gives to the general slum. They're incentivized and to do that they need to have the slum in general on site. That looks like things like giving some of your profits to charity, like Reality Tourism Mumbai. It looks like local tour guides. It looks like all of these things in order to create a beneficial perception that you're doing good both in the slum and outside of the slum. That's why it's going to be
Information, sir.
No, thank you. But finally, the economic benefit that people give to people, which isn't going to directly go to criminal gangs, because we're talking about going to small businesses, ladies and gentlemen, is maybe not so much in absolute terms, but it's enormous in relative terms. It can take the daily income of a local business owner from like $5 a day
Point of
to
information.
$10 a day. No, thank you. Well, that means that they can maybe save $1 a day. That's immensely important for these people. They can't mitigate it by saying that all of that is somehow going to go out to criminal gangs. But firstly, that means they get benefits to their welfare, right? To better provide for themselves. Secondly, it gives them better access to choices. And finally, they're better able to invest in their future. When they talk about projects like microfinance in their first speech and how that can help to develop things, it interacts better when people have more money. so they can actually
Information, sir.
No, thank you. That means that people can actually engage in long-term sustainable benefit when they get a small, absolute, but large relative benefit. So including that, we've proven direct, long-term benefits from slum tourism, maybe to a small amount of individuals, but it amplifies across the slum over a long time. Second point of Team Ireland's case, the economic benefits, the indirect economic benefits. At the start of my speech, I talked about how tourism is an important part of the developmental strategy of so many countries in the economic sense. Let's talk about why that is. It's because, uniquely, slum tourism has a huge multiplier. I'll take you in a second. Why is that? It's because from start to finish, you're consuming so many services. So many people are employed by that industry, from the flight in, the hotel you stay in, to all of the transport you avail in while you're there. So the money goes around the economy in a greater sense. Sir?
It's precisely because slums are often the poorest places that tourists don't actually want to eat the food there or drink the water there because they're afraid it's
We've given you
unsafe
significant
from
reasons
hotel.
as to why they would, sir. It's not inconceivable that a certain slum, maybe in Asia, would be particularly well known for its street food, for instance. That's a really common thing to do in Thailand. It's not inconceivable they might want to consume something like experience the Soweto Jive, Zulu Jive music that they heard off Graceland or something, ladies and gentlemen. That's perfectly conceivable as to why they would want to engage in them. In fact, the whole premise of this debate is that people do want to engage in them by going on slum tours in the first place. I don't think you can contend that there are harms if you don't contend that people want to engage in the first place. So, more on that is that we're saying that lots of people are in on that act. No, thank you. But let's talk about why that money going elsewhere, maybe to a bus company, maybe to a foreign hotel, is still good for that economy. Firstly, because they have to interact with the wider slum economy in terms of the services they consume. That's important because it contributes to the multiplier effect. Secondly, because they might need to employ people from the slum, and that also has a wider benefit to the slum. But moreover, because of infrastructural developments that are incentivized. A, because governments now want to nurture that tourism industry, and B, because companies involved are likely to lobby for it. What does that look like? It looks like transport to and from the city, improving access for tourists and access to the main city from slum residents. So that's good for them in terms of employment and everything else. It looks like things like getting better sewage and better electricity, because slum tourists don't want to be exposed to sewage running through the streets. That's important because it contributes to the welfare of these people. But finally, and most importantly, undermining most of what they said about criminality is that it incentivizes better policing and better security in slums. Because tourism boards want tourists to feel safe. If a lot of tourists are coming to a slum, they're probably going to want to do that a lot better security. So in conclusion, what we have at this point in the debate, we have a proposition that wants to mischaracterize tourists, they want to mischaracterize slums, ladies and gentlemen, and an opposition that shows you real, long-lasting economic benefits that slum tourism has. Engaging with slums is socially and economically empowering, ladies and gentlemen. We're proud to oppose.
Can that be turned up to silent, please? I thank for the first opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, I will call upon the proposition team.
It's frankly quite disappointing to listen to Team Ireland's case, because they seem to almost have fallen into the kinds of naive, condescending narrative that the poor companies try to sell to us today. They tell us that slum tourism benefits people and lifts people out of poverty. But this is a blatant lie, which I'm going to prove to you by asking two questions. First, how are slum tourists like? Secondly, on economic benefits. First, how are slum tourists like? This is an important point, because their entire analysis about how people want to engage with people in slums, about authenticity, rests on your assumption on the simplistic characterization of slum tourists. So here we're going to give you a more realistic portrayal of how slum tourists are like. First, slum tourists, when they visit a slum, tend to feel like they've already done a lot. They think to themselves, I've spent $5,000 on my airfare, I've spent another $1,000 on my hotel accommodation. Look at that, that's $6,000 I'm spending on a single tour. I'm so fixes are possible. They want to believe that when I buy a glass bead from a begging child on the street, I'm helping them, I'm saving their family. When I buy a trinket on the street, that's one family I'm saving from poverty. As a result, they turn blind to the real insidious pressures that drive poverty. Third reason, because slum tourists want to affirm their own financial status. They look at people in slums with their own pitying gazes and go, whoa, thank goodness that someone will never be me. Thank goodness I'm here standing in my perfect suit and standing here without having to live in poor hygiene and sanitation. All the combined weight of these three tiers of analysis proves that slum tourists will not want to engage with people on the ground. They only go there for superficial reasons and for interaction that is short-term and temporary. But next, Ireland told us that tour companies want to create a beneficial perception. That is precisely the problem. When a tour company tells you you are going to the friendliest slum in the world, in Kibera, when it tells you that you're doing something good, you're lifting people out of poverty, you're their moral savior, that is precisely the problem which we condemn. But precisely, we don't need people want to experience the culture. How can you experience the culture when you're a slum tourist who never gets off the bus? When you're a slum tourist who spends 2 hours there and then goes off to a high-end restaurant for a fancy dinner? All of which we don't think is an authentic, genuine portrayal of authenticity. No. So that's their point on tourist development. Secondly, then, on economic benefits. They first gave us a simplistic line about how people in slums need food and water. Slum tourism gives them food and water. First, we don't think this is an accurate portrayal of slums at all. How slums really function is that people can get their food by planting their own crops on land based on allotment. They get water they collect from canals. It's not a binary between people starving or people living. This is a binary that keeps people in poverty solely to satiate their own moral conscience. Secondly, we told you, we asked you, where exactly does this money go to? At worst, it goes to criminal gangs. They simply told us, no, criminal gangs don't exist in slums. Really? The 429 group in Nigeria exists in slums. The Dangote gang exists in Brazil. You tell us where exactly your regulation is so secure. No. But let's think about their best case scenario, where some money goes to slum dwellers. At best, it only goes to individual slum dwellers, which means that the infrastructure they talked about in their first speaker doesn't actually materialize. These benefits are not distributed equally. But finally, they told us that governments now want to improve slums for tourists. This is a lie, because even if that's the case, then governments will only have the incentive to concentrate the improvement of slums in a few single slums where tourists are more likely to visit. They will want to universally and equivocally improve the conditions of slums across the board, especially when these are the worst slums that tourists don't want to visit. This is especially so because tour companies are the ones who bear the risks when tourists get hurt, not governments themselves. But finally, this is a brewing tension in their case. If tourists want authenticity, why would they also want this incredibly sanitized version of a slum where everything is perfectly clean, safe, and perfect? We want the next speaker to deal with this tension in their case. No. So now moving on to my substantive, which will further clash with their material. My substantive is about how you demean those living in slums. The crux of this argument is that by reductively portraying life in slums, you hurt the poor. We start with the foundation that slums do not provide an authentic portrayal of what exactly a life in a slum is like, because slum tours are transient and based on a limited spectator experience. Tour companies further compound this distortion by creating snapshots of the most gratuitous sides to each of tourist sympathies. Therefore, tourists leave with a caricature of slum residents. They see children begging on the streets of Adjudication. They see residents wearing stained shirts and torn shoes in Tikapara. All of which are negative stereotypes that are intrinsically demeaning in principle. This is unlike any other kind of tourism which Team Ireland tried to lie about. The difference is in slum tourism inherently treats poverty as an instrument for people to feel good about themselves. Yes?
Our response to your contention about criminal gangs was that increased policing, even if it's concentrated, would deal with that. You've misrepresented that by telling us that we said that criminal gangs don't exist. Please engage with that.
What exactly are slums? Slums form, as we told you in our first speaker, where government regulation has broken down. That's where communities are forced to fend on their own. If that's the case, where governments can't even help them feed themselves, where people are on the verge of starving as you claim, how exactly is the government going to come in and regulate it? You tell us in our next speaker. So, this means that slum tourism sells a sanitized, twisted version of slums that conforms with what tourists already believe and want to believe. They come expecting a vast contrast between their personal world and the glaring institution of slums. So when someone mentions Africa, most of us immediately think of a young child with a bloated stomach and his hands outstretched, begging the world to spare him a few cents. These are degrading because they are dishonest. They do not do justice to the rich complexion of life in slums where people possess ambitions and lead meaningful lives despite their poverty. So it's insulting in principle because you define slum residents by their impoverishment. Residents are only worthy of the gaze of rich white men because they are abjectly poor. Hence, slum tourism reinforces simplistic stereotypes that hurts those in slums because in principle, it robs them of their complete dignity and holistic identity. But more than that, people don't buy into the toxic, simplistic narrative that slum residents simply need more money, need more shoes, need more clothes. This is unethical in principle, but it also spurs tourists to endorse seemingly beneficial projects that actually do more harm than good. If I go to a slum and I see children begging and walking around barefoot, I am more likely to support the buy one give one program like Tom's, the US shoe company. However, the distribution of millions of cheap cloth shoes has killed domestic shoemaking industries in Ghana and Mozambique and has spread the hookworm parasite. This is not an isolated example, because again in 2010, a program to donate 1 million shirts to Africa decimated local shirt manufacturers while wasting a huge load of money on packing and transporting shirts that weren't even needed to begin with. Therefore, even if they tell us that there's some kind of sympathy generated, this is sympathy that is devoid of true understanding. Furthermore, a gratuitous photograph of a poor Cambodian child posted on Facebook by my friend is infinitely more resonant than anything else. So people are more likely to unknowingly support efforts that destroy local industries, diverting money away from NGOs which use money in more meaningful and targeted ways. In contrast, our site supports NGOs with unique access to on-the-ground realities, and therefore we increase the amount of aid going to slums in the long run. Because people in slums deserve to be dignified, not demeaned, poverty should not be a spectator sport.
I thank for the second opposition speaker for the speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, I will call upon the opposition team.
Mr. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, if people fetishize poverty and misery to the extent of the proposition claim, why does the Hurricane Katrina Memorial spend so much money on explaining the rebuilding of that city? Why do war veterans want people to come to their hospitals and see them heal and recover? Why does Soweto want you to come to that slum and specifically see that slum grow and improve? It's because not only do the proposition misunderstand tourism, they misunderstand the very nature of humanity itself. They misunderstand that people are not misery voyeurs, and instead what people seek is reality, but also the hope that is brought with that reality. Team Ireland brings you a case of 3 points. Firstly, direct economic benefits. Secondly, indirect economic benefits. And thirdly, beneficial changes in perception. And we do this under the team line that engagement with slums is economically and socially empowering. Now, before I deal with that third point, I want to look at our rebuttal and what wasn't responded to. So from our first speaker's case,
Information.
no thank you. We told them of the idea of a spectrum, that there are many different tour companies that operate in slums. They didn't respond to that, only again asserting that there were only ones that engage with crime. Their whole case rests on this idea that crime is the only dominant force in slums.
Information.
No thanks. They never replied to our point about microfinance, that very small amounts of money to people empowers them to buy their land, which is empowering. And they never responded to our point about infrastructure and lobbying, how you get police in there, only to assert that police never went into slums never responded
Information.
to our point about welfare services. No thanks. Okay, so looking at the two areas that are coming up in clash, it is the economy and the social element. They never responded to our point when we responded to seasonality, telling them people can work other jobs and save. That point falls there. They need to respond to that if they want to stay in the debate. But moreover, crime is such a big point that they stop. So I want to deal with that. Because their claim in the debate is that criminals get all the money from slum tourism. If that were true, criminals have many competing ways of getting money, like the economy our first speaker tells you about. That means while they get that money, they will also be more powerful to engage in things like drug dealing, engage in turf wars. That would lead to, no thank you, such a large amount of crime that slum tourism simply wouldn't take place in these places, and that governments would ultimately have to intervene in those cases. Moreover, slums aren't controlled by crime. Slums, like in Rohingya, have sent police units in there and social workers which have dealt with much of their problems. We didn't get a single example of a slum that is absolutely controlled by poverty, and even if they could, that is on the fringes. Their case does not recognise the spectrum. No thanks. We were told there's no incentive to develop. We asked why governments only develop in one way, and they said, oh look, you're just going to lead to the development of a few slums that engage in slum tourism. If that is true, that is not a harm. That is just some benefits for some slums. In reality, governments don't just go, well, I will just develop slums in one way, because governments like to develop their slums in multiple ways, because that is economically sensible. Okay, and finally on this point about not sending their children to school. Because of slum tourism. If that is true, that is a concession that almost every person in slums works in slum tourism. Untrue, but it's also a problem about poverty, because that is true with the scrap metal industry. That often people don't send their children to schools because they want them to work in scrap metal. We're not sure why that is specifically about slum tourism and not about poverty itself. They're not addressing their graves in this debate. But finally, about the humanization point. No thanks. They tell us that people don't want to engage with slums because they've spent a lot of money already. They want to see a quick fix, and slum tourism want to give them that snapshot. That is fundamentally untrue because of what I tell you. Slum tourists just wouldn't want to engage in that way because it doesn't represent the reality of humanity. That people wouldn't want to go to slums and leave feeling miserable, because that's not a good business model, Mr. Chair. It's not good to have people feel miserable and misrepresented. Moreover, if people felt the slums were being misrepresented, then they would go and tell their friends that this was a bad slum tour, and therefore that slum tour would struggle to exist, because there are other good ones that we told you about that do represent slum property. They're not engaging with reality. Go ahead.
On one hand, tourists want to see authentic poverty. On the other hand, governments will clean up slums to make it safe and hospitable. Which is it and why?
We disagree with your contention that all slums are inherently homogeneously areas of poverty, because in reality, slums have a wide spectrum of some areas being more developed within slums than other ones. That's why slum tours can show different areas. That is authenticity. It is not authentic to tell people that poverty is the only thing that exists in a slum. It is counterintuitive. So ultimately, after a bubble, their point about economics makes no sense because it is not grounded in reality. Their social point falls because they fail to understand humans. Okay, Team Ireland's point. No, thank you. Team Ireland's third point: beneficial changes in perception. We think we can change perceptions in two ways: for slum tourists and for residents. Looking at these slum residents, the proposition tell you that there is a pervasive narrative of slums being areas of homogeneous poverty, the one they sell you in their own speech. We empower people to break this down. Why? Because we have local guides who work in these areas, and even when you don't, people in slums can talk to slum tourists in there. That empowers those people to take control of the narrative. No, thank you. That allows them basically to break down this idea that slums are areas of homogeneous poverty. They get to say, yes, there is poverty in this area, but there is also incredible business and innovation elsewhere. That means their lives are less misrepresented by their government, less misrepresented by this proposition. But they get to explain their culture and their religion, things that are so often devalued by the outside world, by their own country. That is an incredible psychological benefit. No thanks. But finally, you break down the isolation, because no longer can governments and societies tell people in slums that the only thing that they can be is a slum resident, and that's all they can ever amount to. Because those people get to engage with people outside the slums. They get to see that a life can exist for them, and that breaks down the isolation that they do feel. We're not saying that means everyone in slums goes to a university. That means that people
Point of information.
try to improve their lives because they get prevailing counter-narratives. And I'll take you, go ahead.
So, if you think slums have welfare and policing services and offer extremely well-thriving business areas, why are they still slums?
Because slums aren't what you define them as. Slums are many different areas within them. Just because you have a welfare service or roads does not mean that you are suddenly a middle-class person. Like, that is a fundamental mischaracterization of what a slum is. You just wanted to talk about crime and poverty. We wanted to bring you reality. But moreover, the impact on tourists. Because tourists see real poverty. They see that, yes, some people in 2014 still live in corrugated iron buildings, but they also get to see the business and the innovation. And that fundamentally changes their idea about slums. The majority give money on those tours, where it leads to some to engage in sustained giving, because they see that poverty isn't about giving hand to mouth to these people, just funding foreign aid. It's about funding clever projects and investment that lifts those people out of poverty. And a minority become involved in different ways, where they fundraise for those people and help them to engage and better those things. So in conclusion, by changing the perceptions of slums, we break down the barrier between slum residents and the outside world, leading to positive consequences for both people in slums. And Mr. Chair, engagement with slums is socially and economically empowering. We are incredibly happy to oppose.
Thanks for the second opposition speaker for this speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, I will call upon the opposition team.
In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, thousands of people turned up in New Orleans bearing food parcels. They weren't aid workers. They were tourists looking to satisfy their moral angst by observing the horrible effects of the tragedy. The fundamental problem with opposition's case is that it suffers from an overly naive and optimistic conception of how humanity is like. Let's examine the flaws of their case in 3 areas. 1, on the principal problem with slum tourism. 2nd, on the economic benefits that they lie come about. 3rd, on the conceptual benefits of slum tourism. First, on the principle. Now, we've heard the argument that slum tourism is no different from consumer tourism. Now I'm going to explain what the difference is. Slum tourism belongs to a category of tourism where tourists are in an asymmetrically more powerful position than people. They are spectators. They enter a slum to view its residents like animals in a zoo. Poverty becomes a constructed experience. No, thank you. You drive through a slum for 2 hours in a bus. You peer at children trying to sell you trinkets. You use the poor as pressure valves for your moral outrage. People don't leave the slums feeling miserable. Don't let their second speaker mischaracterize this. They leave the slums feeling good because they believe when I give that 5 rupees to a child beggar, I help feed his family for the next week. People believe in a quick fix to these solutions. This is different from all other kinds of tourism. Because when tourists engage, for instance, in social dialogue or cultural dialogue in a museum or cultural performance, I'm not turning someone's vulnerability into an instrument for my moral gratification. That's why we reject sex tourism. We reject disaster tourism. We reject dark tourism. Because they turn people, they turn disaster into something that I internalize and I feel good about after my experience. It's unprincipled. We've taken this point, moved on, it died in the second speaker. No thank you. Let me move on to the second area of clash, a much bigger one, on economic optimism. First claim, we never dealt with the spectrum of tour agencies. First, rebuttal. There is no meaningful spectrum because if a tour agency is not in it for profit, it will die. It will be out-competed by other tour agencies that are capable of providing better services and more diversity. You can't claim that there are well-intentioned tour agencies in this way. Well, they might be good tour agencies that have no interest in helping the slums but don't do it any more harm, but it doesn't add to their case. But on the worst case scenario, when you do have a tour agency whose business model is predicated on the existence of poverty and slum, no thank you, that's exactly when you incentivize our tour agencies to engage in the kinds of nefarious schemes and bribery that my first speaker talked about, never rebutted. Second, we heard, governments now have the incentive to improve conditions in the slums. This is naive. Opposition doesn't understand the incentive structure of developing governments, no thank you. If tourists are hurt in the slums, governments aren't the ones who will be sued. Governments aren't the ones who suffer from a loss of profits. It's the tour agency. That's why it's always about the tour agency that ends up providing protection, that ends up providing security. And these protections and security end up funding criminal syndicates who are the only party with the logistical and equipment capability to do so. Second response, this is an unresolved contradiction. You can't argue on one hand, tourists want an authentic experience in the slums, and on the other hand, the tourists really want government to clean up and sanitize the slums. But okay, even if you concede that, third response, even if the government wanted to improve the slums, they cannot. Why is this the case? Because slums form where governmental jurisdiction fails, where the underprivileged in society gravitate to areas that are outside jurisdictional control, so say police forces of the law. That's why they can occupy buildings or land and the government can't evict them. If the government could do so, they would have done so long ago already. Fourth response, even if people wanted to leave the slums, even if government tried to improve these conditions by building better facilities outside the slums, people still gravitate back in because the only skills they have learned, the only thing they know how to do is to sell trinkets, is to beg on the street, to pretend that I'm poor, to sell my poverty to the white man who is giving me money. This does not provide any kind of long-term growth or incentivization for change. Next, we heard we can legislate the problem of criminality away. Apart from the fact that I've already proven that slums are where government monopolies of force fail, we have shown how we exacerbate the problem. I posit to you that there will be no demand for tourist souvenirs if tourists don't go to slums. I posit to you that there will be less demand for child beggars if there are fewer rich tourists who are entering the slums who will be attacked on an emotional level and want to give that money to that beggar. You create the kinds of problems of criminal syndicates. You increase the supply of child beggars because it's so much more lucrative and profitable to kidnap children. You increase the money they have to engage in racketeering rings, to engage in things like child kidnapping. For every $10 that goes to a child beggar, 9 rupees goes to that criminal syndicate, and that's 9 rupees worth of damage as opposed to your 1 rupee worth of benefit. But before I go on, yes.
If criminals could get that powerful and have that level of turf wars, how could slum tourism even be a thing?
Thanks, sir. Because tour agencies hire these criminal syndicates to protect individuals who enter these slums. There is collusion going on, sir. And even if we argue that these turf wars aren't happening like every day on the streets, what we are arguing is such criminal influence is insidious. You don't see the gang members hanging around in the slums. It's every night that they come around to your street vendors and demand 90% of their profits. It's every night when they get all the child beggars back to their orphanages and demand their profits. So it's not out in the open, so don't lie to me that tourists will go there. Last thing we heard, slum tourism provides money. This is good because of multiplier effect and microfinance. First response, when this money is going to your criminal gangs and when you're building up skills that are not applicable to the money economy, for instance by only begging on the streets, by only selling trinkets, these ideas of microfinance don't actually work because you don't have that foundational capacity to engage in the economy. Second response, that money is not that important. It's precisely because it's a tiny amount of money that it doesn't make a substantial difference in the lives of people in the slums. It is perceived to be such. That's why people's aspirations in poverty change. However, objectively speaking, it's not that important. No thank you. So opposition would force people to rely on the tiny variable dribble of money that flows through slum tourism, even though the history of the past 20 years, as my first speaker suggested, shows that slum tourism never actually benefits. Alright, I'm going to move on to the perceptional point that the second speaker brought up. They make people recognize the vibrancy of slums. First, this is in direct contradiction to what my first speaker told you about how slum tourism kills the vibrancy of slum areas. So when you go to slums, you tend to be more desolate areas. There are going to be fewer opportunities in which you can engage with individuals living in the slums. Furthermore, we argue that the actual engagement you are in is very limited because of the frame in which the slum tourists enter the slum. You see yourself as the observer, the spectator, and the slum resident sees him or herself as the recipient of your aid. So any kind of meaningful interaction is just limited to you handing the slum tourist money. Any kind of meaningful interaction is limited to you snapping a few photographs. So you don't pop the image of poverty that's inside these tourists' head. Instead, you reinforce it, as my second speaker said, further hurting the kinds of support for corporate aid programs in our status quo. Furthermore, we point out that this is intrinsically demeaning to people who are in the slums, an argument that was dropped. And then finally, we dispute that people will join non-governmental organizations because they perceive their moral debt to be repaid, that at the point of entering the slum, I could have done something good already if non-fungible in that nature. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to stand by the base principle that poverty should not be a spectator sport.
I thank for the third opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, I will call upon the opposition team.
Mr. Chairman, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, this proposition would have you believe that slums are only about poverty. That slum tourists fetishize poverty. This, ladies and gentlemen, misrepresents people. This misrepresents the culture of slums. This misrepresents the fact that people might want to experience that culture of those slums, and in the process, economically develop these areas, help the people living in those slums. They tell us that this culture is so awful. They tell us they have the audacity to compare the culture and the lives of people who live in slums to sex tourism. That is disgusting. That isn't right. These people have a culture and a life that has value. They're not animals in the zoo. People can engage with them and experience a life with them as well. So, Team Ireland has brought you a case today made up of 3 points. 1, direct economic benefits. 2, indirect economic benefits. No, thank you. 3, beneficial changes in perception. And we have done this under Team Line, that engagement in slums is socially and economically imperative. I'm going to look at 2 questions that have come into debate. 1, are there long-term and serious economic benefits to slum tourism? And secondly, is slum tourism dehumanizing? What I will prove now is how we have brought you a series of concrete benefits that outweigh the harms that they have brought up. No, thank you. And the harms that they have brought up are actually benefits disguised as harms, or are harms that aren't actually caused by slum tourism, but are actually part of what slums are. So firstly, on this issue of are there economic benefits to slum tourism? They brought us some analysis about seasonality. We responded to that with ideas of why we can't do things, why people can't save, why people can't work in other jobs. We got no response to this, so we're willing to assume that they conceded the seasonality response. No, thank you. Throughout their case, they failed to prove how poverty is exacerbated by poverty. They never proved that harm. So we believe that from the start of this debate, that is neutral, and therefore the benefits that we bring you show how it is better economically for them. Throughout all of their, they have told us that firms are motivated, their proposition told us, that firms are motivated by profit. We agree. That's what they want to provide you with any experience. No, thank you. Tour guides will have to provide tourists with a real experience that will give them something that they will want to go home and tell friends about. That when they go on TripAdvisor and compare, some people will say, oh no, this was run by like an organisation that's very commercial, where this group of families brought you like a very real experience. The proposition has in essence rested their case on economics, on the ground of this ridiculous analysis to do with criminal enterprises. The second speaker told us that they kind of conceded about our analysis on investment in policing. What they said is,
information.
no thank you, well yeah, it will actually probably happen in some areas, but it won't happen everywhere. So what they're conceding is that benefits do exist in some places, and that other places won't have those benefits, and they'll still be affected with the problem to do with, the criminality that is a result of, living in a slum. It is not a harm brought about by slum tourism. So we don't think that this is relevant to their debate. No thank you. So on this criminality, as we've told you, policing is going to become better because it's going to be part of a development strategy. Areas are going to want to have better policing so that they can incentivize more tourists to come to them, so they can economically develop that area and economically develop that slum. Because obviously states which are rational are going to want their economies to develop. Go ahead.
People go to slums because it has distinctive features, which tend to be centered around poverty. If I wanted to experience the football culture of Brazil, why wouldn't I go to Copacabana Beach?
And why wouldn't you go to the slums, where some of the best football players in the world originated from? Why are there special tours in Brazil that bring you to slums to show you where certain Brazilian football players were born and the streets in which they learned their trade? Can you give us an answer to that? They all, no thank you. They gave us the response about how policing can sometimes be concentrated. We told you how that is a concession. They misrepresent our case by us saying that crime didn't exist. We do understand that crime exists, but we don't say it's a problem to do with slum tourism. No, thank you. We say criminality is a harm, is a wider harm that is under status quo, and we don't think it stops slum tourism by the very nature of the fact that people go into slums and that they engage with them. We also don't think that there is a tension between saying, I want to experience a culture, and they said people won't want a safe experience. There's no incentive to put an investment. There's no contradiction between saying as a tourist, I want to experience a culture, but I also want to be safe. And governments are aware of this, and they invest in that regard. They told us that gangs are going to, take all the money themselves. We don't think that's a rational thing, that when you go into a slum and you buy water, off a stand, or you buy a trinket to bring home, or you buy some food, that, all of those organizations are run by gangs. We don't think that's a rational thing to say. So, they give us, the example of criminal gang control. They have no examples to back this up. We think it's untrue. Thank you. The proposition asks in a POI, if there is development, why is there slums? That is as illogical as saying, well, we've been investing in this slum as a government for 2 years, there's still a slum, we better stop. We don't think that makes any sense. So in conclusion to this point, we have proved, thank you, that economic benefits exist, and that these benefits make life better for slum dwellers. And that we've shown that the harms that they brought are actually benefits, or they are in no way related to slum tourism. So therefore, our argument in economic analysis begins. Now, the problem issue of is slum tourism dehumanizing, to which we say it isn't. No thank you. They said in our they misrepresented us in our third speech by saying, that we've said that everyone is going to join NGOs. No, we didn't. We said that some people are going to be involved. So thank you. We said that some people, most likely a minority of people, are going to have an experience that can fundamentally change the way they view the world and how they view that area, and it might make them want to go home and help. So thank you. On this side of the house, we have faith in humans. We have faith that experiences shape humans, and an experience like a slum tour may lead you to help the area you're in a bit more, and not go home and say, oh Jesus, my life is great, and I don't want to help that area anymore. We brought you analysis about narratives. And how we say what happens with slums is that people, people see that when they go to slums, that awful things are happening in those slums, which incentivizes governments to make change, to provide people with empowering narratives. Now that they are developing, they are becoming a serious economic player who that government now has to take seriously and engage with, and they can no longer be shut out. This empowerment leads to community groups. It leads to organizations who can have control, engage in the narrative, and empower this area. They brought us responses to deal with how they told us about how people fetishize poverty. But as we have told you throughout our case, people go for other reasons. People who go. We also don't take this image of that Western tourist going with his camera and just like viewing things awfully. Like we say the fact that people can respect tourist sites. We look at the way people dress when they go to the Vatican. We look at the way people dress when they go to temples. People respect people's culture. Like that is a rational thing to assume that people have respect for other cultures. That people aren't awful. That people like aren't unhuman and will have no respect and will fetishize the poverty. Like they talk to us in a narrative of awful poverty, but we say we can tackle this. When perceptions of slum, they talk to us about the perceptions of like what slums are. We say those perceptions exist under their under status quo, under their side of the house as well, because like when you see the only knowledge of slum you have is that you hear about, is what you watch on television. We say that can be directly challenged when you go to visit a slum, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, engagement with slums is socially and economically empowering. Thank you.
Speaker for his speech, and now we move on to team 4 minutes concluding reply speech. The opposition team will deliver their reply speech. First, there are no points of information during the reply speech. To deliver the opposition reply speech, I will call upon the opposition team.
Mr. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of this debate, Team Ireland gave you, in our very first speech, the criteria by which this debate would be won and lost. We told you firstly the proposition had to show us that there were harms associated with slum tourism. Secondly, they needed to show us that those harms were caused by slum tourism. And thirdly, they needed to show you that those harms outweighed the benefits that we were going to show you on this side of the House. That was a burden that throughout this debate they neither disputed nor discharged. All the harms they tried to show around perceptions, we were able to show you, were actually benefits in our analysis on narratives. All of the harms they tried to show you in terms of economics and everything else and criminality, we were able to show you were actually harms associated with poverty. Over the course of 3 speeches, we challenged them to show us the link between poverty being exacerbated by observation, and they could never do it. And finally, they never even attempted to do anything more than minimize our economic and social narratives conceived in the first speech when they talked about the immediate economic developments right there at the start. And that's why they've lost. I'm going to analyze 2 dimensions of this debate in this reply and explaining why the proposition falls. Firstly, the social dimension. Now, the great failure of Team Singapore's case in this debate was resting the entire winning and losing of this debate on their analysis on criminality. As far as we're concerned, they might as well have taken all their money, gone to Vegas, and put it on black, ladies and gentlemen. Because in our first speech, we respond to that immediately. And we tell you, from the first words out of my mouth, that actually it's a huge part of the developmental strategy of many developing countries, ladies and gentlemen, providing consistent analysis down this side of the table as to why they would actually be incentivized to police it better. Then their second speaker came up and decided they were going to misrepresent that by claiming that we claimed that criminality isn't a thing. But then they took the step of conceding that point when they said that actually it was only going to be concentrated in a certain few areas where there was slum tourism, which meant that slum tourism was going to do more harm than good, ladies and gentlemen. But we went on to deepen that down the table when we told you that even if that was the case, even if it could get that out of hand in terms of criminality, at some point the government would probably want to step in to prevent the brewing anarchy that was going around the slums. That was never responded to by that team. Next thing that point of that social dimension display is they tried to flag attention early on in this when they said that, we can't want an authentic experience and also want to be safe. There's no contradiction between being a tourist and saying, I want to experience, my favorite music or football players and get all that culture, but I don't want to get poo on my shoes. I like to have electricity when I go to the bathroom or something like that. All of those things are important things. All of those things are reasons why we analyze from first, second, and third why there would be development in slum. Because governments would go for it, and because businesses were going to lobby for it, ladies and gentlemen. Only one of those incentives was ever engaged. They never talked about the lobbying side. So, secondly, on this the economic dimension of debate, which is what we brought you mainly in our first speech. That was most of our content in that first speech, was talking about the direct and indirect economic benefits. They tried to mischaracterize slum tours by saying it could only ever be on a bus. They went through this entire debate without a single example of a cynically run slum tour. We were able to bring you our first speech the example of reality tours Mumbai. We were able to tell you that the guides were actually incentivized to give you the best and most immersive experience, so you would get direct engagement with local business owners, so you would get direct engagement with local cultures, because that is the nature of the experience that these tourists are seeking. That is the incentive that faces the people going into these, the people providing these tours, and that is why that would happen. No response except for mischaracterization of that. No response to all of that element of that argument. But moreover, we told you it didn't even matter, ladies and gentlemen, if not all of the money went directly to those local business owners. We had an entire second point, which they dealt with very minimally, about the indirect economic benefits, in terms of the services that these other companies would have to consume, in terms of the employment that it would bring. All their attacks were leveraged on the basis that in terms of economics there would be less engagement. We had a case which A, beat that, and B, didn't need to beat that because we had other analysis in it. Ladies and gentlemen, engagement with slums is socially and economically empowering. The proposition falls.
Now, to conclude the case for the opposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon the opposition team.
I hate to say this, but it's only a sign of opposition's desperation when they start accusing us of blatant misrepresentation of every single point, of not responding to every single argument. We have been consistent down the line, protecting both the principle that you can't treat people as instruments for your own moral ends, as well as the practical, social, and economic benefits. So that, let's look at the two words we saw emerge in today's debate and show what was opposition's vote that truly had the moral high ground. But first, what was opposition's vote? Opposition's vote suffered from a deficit of morality and humanity. Their vision of empowerment was when a tourist from France peers at a Nigerian child from a double-decker bus and indulges in an outpouring of sympathy. Their vision of empowerment is when a tourist from Britain takes photographs of a poor Cambodian mother and shares it on Facebook because he now knows what poverty looks like. Their vision of empowerment is when a tourist from New Zealand watches Brazilian children in torn shirts and thinks to himself, thank goodness I will never be this poor. By watching, gazing, hearing, and staring, listen to the language of opposition. They themselves reduce people in slums as nothing more as animals to feed and live off the pitying gazes of some savior who will now rescue them out of poverty. But in opposition's vote, their naivety amounted to moral bankruptcy. Because yes, they were hungry for 10 tourist dollars, but they never thought about where those dollars went to. At worst, it went to funding abduction and sex trade. That was a benefit. At best, it went to individual families, so no infrastructure was built. That was a benefit. Moreover, this was money that could otherwise have been spent on NGOs development. That was a benefit to them. But this was when their case truly contorted. They started rebutting phantom points we never made. We never said that, we never brought up the idea of seasonality. That was the point they raised in their own first speaker. We never conceded that police can regulate it. We were merely saying that even if police can regulate it, it still suffers. They accused us of providing no examples of gangs. In my speech, I told you about the 429 group in Nigeria and Dagrota in Brazil. Don't tell me these aren't examples. By the time it came onto the reply speaker, they told us that you can't expect all people to go on slum tours to join NGOs. It's a minority of people. So already their case shrank. But finally, let's point out that they eventually shifted the debate on our grounds because they dropped their own point on starvation, which they made in their first speak. What was the alternative world we offered you in proposition? Don't get us wrong, we did not rest our case on criminality. We talked about social perceptions, where you don't treat people in slums as mere specimens, when now your perceptions of people in slums means that you're now more inclined to help at an NGO or volunteer at a charity or work as a missionary. You don't divert your money to some silly corporate scheme like Tom's or 1 million shirts. Let me point out this is an argument they completely dropped and never dealt with. They accused us that it's not a problem of slum tourism, it's a problem of poverty. Yes, it's a problem of slum tourism because slum tourism creates the demand and fuels money into gangs. That's why by their own metric of showing that the harms are caused by slum tourism, we have satisfied that metric. Moreover, we told you that slums do have a culture. To a tourist, that culture is that of poverty. If you wanted the Brazilian culture of football, you would go to Copacabana Beach, not a slum. So people don't go to slums for engagement. But finally, we help to uplift people out of poverty. People now could go to schools because parents were more willing to send their children there because people didn't internalize their own poverty because they no longer had to face a choice of working 2 jobs but could now go to schools. All of which was further analysis they completely dropped. Which is why, because people in slums deserve to be dignified and not demeaned, poverty cannot and should not be a spectator sport.
I'd just like to congratulate both teams on what the panel agreed was an incredibly high quality debate. Reflecting that quality of the debate and the incredible closeness of the debate, we have had a split decision on the panel. I'm going to step through style, strategy, and content and explain how each of those fell. On the first question of strategy, of style, we felt like Singapore had extremely strong and clear style, bringing a lot of clarity to the debate. Ireland, we felt, also had strong style at times, but at other times that style dropped away and was a little bit less compelling. That said, Singapore was at times overly aggressive, particularly in the offering of points of information. So Singapore may have had a slight edge on the question of style. Secondly then, on the question of strategy. We felt like Ireland was very successful in making sure their material held up weight in the debate, bringing back the material that they thought was particularly important. The panel agreed that Singapore could have been a little bit stronger in making sure that some of their best material held a little bit more water in the debate by making sure that the other team wasn't able to ignore it. The other point that the adjudication panel would like to point out with respect to strategy is both teams played a little bit fast and loose with the word unresponsive in this debate. We actually think both teams did a really good job of engaging with each other, and to merely claim unresponsiveness was a little bit weak, although Ireland was perhaps a little less guilty of this crime than Singapore. So strategically, Ireland perhaps had a slight advantage. To turn then finally to the question of content. There were largely 2 questions to look at with respect to content. The first was, what are slum tourists like? And how does that socially reflect on slum tourists? The second was a question of how we best develop slums. On the first question about the social development and what slum tourists are like, we felt like Ireland was able to bring the more sophisticated and nuanced picture of what slum tourists were like. Singapore at times was overly willing to simplify this issue down to a small conceptualization of people, perhaps over-focusing on their description of slum tourists. Side opposition, on the other hand, was able to tell us in a lot more depth exactly what they thought slum tourism looked like, telling us that it wasn't just people who were going to investigate poverty, it was also people who were interested in things like culture. As a consequence of that, we felt like they had the upper hand in representing what slum tourists were like and the way they were likely to behave. Meaning that slum tourism wasn't demeaning as side proposition wanted to characterize it, but perhaps it was more a way for people to understand culture. So Ireland was successful in that respect, although this issue was quite close. The second question then had to be one of economic benefits. The first claim made by side proposition, the panel felt was quite compelling, given that they explained that it reduced government support and allowed the government to pass the buck. And here's where we thought that Singapore's strategy could have been improved in emphasizing that material more. Because while we found that material compelling, we don't know that it held a lot of weight in the debate because it didn't get enough explanation. The place where they did focus a little bit more of their explanation then was on the question of crime. They told us that as a consequence of crime, there was going to be not as much money as Ireland said there would be flowing into these communities, and the slum tourism would actually facilitate this crime. Ireland did a couple of things to respond to this material. They told us that the crime wasn't as broad as side proposition would have us believe. They told us it wasn't caused by slum tourism, and that the crime actually that slum tourism actually created positive incentives to change. The panel agreed that Singapore had a slight edge on this issue, but not a very, very significant one. Singapore could have enhanced this edge by explaining the material in a little bit more depth and showing exactly how those harms were going to play out. So Singapore didn't have a huge advantage there, although it did perhaps mitigate the economic benefits brought to us by Ireland. What were those benefits? They told us that there were benefits to specific businesses, which was similar to a form of microcredit, which meant that people could develop and were able to succeed a little bit more in society. Some of their strong material was about the indirect benefits to this, although again, this could have been better prioritized within the case of Team Ireland. There was some discussion of the consequences of this on development and of education within the communities, with Singapore telling us that it meant that fewer children were likely to go to school. Again, we think Singapore could have better prioritized this material, and that Ireland was able to get away with some responses that weren't necessarily as sophisticated as were necessary, saying that not everyone was involved in slum tourism, and that people not attending school was a consequence of poverty, not of that tourism. Similarly, on the question of the way people engage with poverty, we felt, for instance, in donating to Tom's Shoes as a charity, Singapore could have pushed this more and explained the harms a little bit more. At the end of the debate, the panel didn't think that either team had a very significant economic benefit, because Singapore well proved that there was consequences of crime, but Ireland did have significant material about microcredit. The consequence of that is that we felt like the island's superior characterization on what slum tourists were like held up in the debate, and that's why this debate has, in a very close decision, gone to Team Ireland.